Ever feel like there's this, like, giant vault out there, just packs with stories and all kinds of knowledge just waiting to be discovered?
It's like a treasure chest, but for, like, your brain.
Exactly. Well, that's what we're all about here at All Sorts Podcast. We're your key to unlocking those fascinating corners of history, science, you name it.
Whether you've been with us since the very beginning or just tuning in for the first time, get ready for a serious deep dive.
And remember, you can explore our entire library of podcasts over on YouTube. So many deep dives, so much knowledge waiting for you.
And don't forget to connect with us and other curious minds on X, Instagram, and Threads.
Today, we're strapping in for a flight back in time to World War II, focusing on a unique piece of Japanese aviation, the Kawasaki Ki-45 Toryu, a twin-engine fighter with well, let's just say, a story full of twists and turns.
And as always, this deep dive is tailored specifically for you, our amazing listeners. We're drawing from the sources you provided to bring you the most intriguing and, honestly, sometimes surprising insights about this aircraft's development and service.
We're on a mission to uncover the hidden gems, the unexpected turns in the story of the Ki-45.
It's fascinating how the Ki-45's path wasn't exactly a straight line. It started with one purpose, long-range escort, but things got a little bumpy. Then it found its true calling later in the war, playing a vital role as a night fighter, a role it wasn't originally designed for at all.
So if I'm getting this right, the whole concept of a twin-engine, long-range fighter, that wasn't something the Japanese were known for back then, right? What was the driving force behind that interest?
You're absolutely right. It wasn't their typical approach. But they were definitely keeping an eye on what was happening in Europe and America. Twin-engine designs were proving their worth, especially when it came to covering those long distances.
Makes sense. Given the vastness of the Pacific theater, their single-engine fighters just couldn't cut it for those extended missions.
Precisely. Japanese military planners saw the potential of twin-engine aircraft to really project their power further.
So they sent out the call in March 1937, asking manufacturers to explore these designs. But I'm guessing they didn't have a super clear picture of what they wanted, right?
You hit the nail on the head. There was some serious debate within the Army about what this new fighter should prioritize. Should it be a heavy hitter, packing some serious firepower? Should it be all about speed to catch those enemy bombers? Or should it be a nimble dogfighter able to outmaneuver its opponents?
It sounds like a recipe for confusion for the design teams.
It definitely made things challenging. But despite that, 3 companies initially stepped up to the plate: Nakajima, Kawasaki, and Mitsubishi. They each came up with their own proposals: the Ki-37, Ki-38, and Ki-39, respectively.
So a three-way race for the next big thing in Japanese aviation.
You could say that, but as it often goes in the world of aircraft development, priorities shifted. Nakajima and Mitsubishi decided to focus their energy elsewhere, leaving Kawasaki as the sole contender, continuing to refine their Ki-38 design under the leadership of Isamu Mashi.
So what did this Ki-38 look like on paper? What was the initial concept?
Picture this: a sleek, elegant monoplane with those beautiful elliptical wings. They were going for a classic look, and the plan was to use 2 liquid-cooled 12-cylinder engines for power. By October 1937, they had even built a full-scale mock-up of the Ki-38. It was starting to feel real.
But then, it seems like the project hit a bit of a snag.
Yeah, things stalled for a bit. While Kawasaki was making progress, the Army was still grappling with those fundamental questions about what they really wanted from this twin-engine fighter. It was a time of reassessment, leading to a temporary pause in the Ki-38's development.
It's like they hit the pause button while they figured things out. What was the catalyst that breathed new life into the project?
December 1937 brought a significant shift. Kawasaki received a new directive. Instead of sticking with the Ki-38 as it was, they were tasked with transforming it into what would eventually become the Ki-45.
So this wasn't just a minor adjustment. This was a whole new set of goals.
Exactly. The Army had refined their vision. They wanted a 2-seat, twin-engine fighter with improved performance specs. The stakes were higher now.
Okay, so the Ki-45 was born from this renewed focus. What kind of performance benchmarks were they aiming for this time around?
They set some pretty ambitious targets. The Ki-45 needed to reach a top speed of 540 kilometers per hour at an altitude of 3,500 meters. They also wanted it to operate comfortably between 2,000 and 5,000 meters, and crucially, it needed to have an endurance of nearly 5 hours at cruising speed. That's essential for those long patrols over the vast Pacific.
It had to be a real workhorse, capable of covering serious ground. And what about its ability to bring the fight to the enemy? What was the plan for its firepower?
The initial armament plan included forward-firing guns for head-on attacks and, for defense, a flexible rear machine gun operated by the second crew member. It was a classic offensive-defensive setup for a two-seater.
Makes sense. And the engines. Choosing the right power plant for a twin-engine design, that's got to be crucial.
Absolutely. They decided to go with two Nakajima Ha-20B 9-cylinder radial engines. Now, for those listening who might not be engine experts, these were essentially Japanese-built versions of the Bristol Mercury engine, a tried-and-true European design. So they're building on a solid foundation.
So they had their performance targets, they had their engines. It was finally time to get this Ki-45 off the ground right.
You bet. The development process kicked into high gear in early 1938 with Takeo Doi at the helm of the Kawasaki design team. And by January 1939, they had rolled out the first prototype, officially designated the Army Experimental Ki-45 from their Gifu plant.
Okay, paint us a picture of this first prototype. What did it look like?
The first prototype was powered by those two 820-horsepower Ha-20B engines. However, these engines were housed in these pretty bulky nacelles. Now, nacelles are those streamlined coverings that enclose the engines, and in this case, they turned out to be a source of drag, which would come back to bite them later.
Drag's never a good thing when you're trying to fly fast.
Not at all. And for armament, it was packing two 7.7mm machine guns in the nose, a 20mm Ho-3 cannon mounted underneath the fuselage, and a 7.7mm flexible machine gun in the rear cockpit for the observer.
Sounds like a decent amount of firepower, but I have a feeling those early flight tests weren't all smooth sailing.
You'd be right. Those initial tests revealed some serious hurdles. Sometimes those Ha-20B engines just didn't deliver the power they were supposed to. The manually operated undercarriage, the landing gear, proved to be unreliable and a real pain to retract. And, as we mentioned earlier, those chunky engine nacelles were creating a ton of drag, which was really hampering its speed.
So back to the drawing board it was.
Not quite a complete restart, but definitely a call for some serious adjustments. Kawasaki went back to work, focusing on reducing that pesky drag.
Time for some aerodynamic fine-tuning.
Exactly. The second and third prototypes incorporated some key modifications. They streamlined the engine cowlings, those forward-facing parts of the nacelles. They added propeller spinners, those conical things at the front of the propeller hub to smooth out the airflow. And on the third prototype, they even tried using ducted spinners. Those were designed to improve airflow through the engine for better cooling.
Sounds like they were pulling out all the stops to squeeze out every bit of performance.
They were definitely trying. And while those modifications did lead to some improvement, it still wasn't enough to meet the Army's ambitious requirements. The third prototype only managed to hit about 480 kilometers per hour at 4,000 meters. They were still short of that 540-kilometer target. And they were still battling with nacelle stall, which was affecting its handling.
Okay, now you have to explain nacelle stall for those of us who aren't aeronautical engineers.
Sure, think of it this way. When the airflow around those engine nacelles gets disrupted, it can cause a loss of lift on the wing, potentially leading to a loss of control. It's like the wing suddenly loses its grip on the air. Kawasaki even considered using handed propellers, those that rotate in opposite directions, to try and counteract those asymmetrical forces.
Interesting idea. Did it work?
Well, before they could fully explore that, the Army hit the brakes on the flight trials in late 1939. They had several unfinished prototypes just sitting there while they reevaluated the whole program. It was a critical moment for the Ki-45.
Sounds like they were at a crossroads. What was the turning point that saved the project from being scrapped?
April 1940 brought a game changer. The Army gave Kawasaki a very specific task. Take one of the unfinished airframes, specifically number 4507, and fit it with entirely new engines.
New engines? What was the thinking behind that?
The new engines were the Nakajima Ha-25 radial engines. These were more compact than the previous ones and packed a much bigger punch, delivering a whopping 1,000 horsepower each. Plus, they had single-stage superchargers.
Okay, time for a quick engine lesson. Superchargers. What do they do?
Superchargers force more air into the engine, which allows it to produce more power, especially at higher altitudes. Think of it as giving the engine a boost.
So these new engines must have had a pretty significant impact on the Ki-45's design.
Absolutely. They had to redesign those troublesome engine nacelles. They went for a NECA-style nacelle design. Now, NECA was the predecessor to NASA, and their research led to some incredibly efficient aerodynamic shapes. These new nacelles were much more streamlined, which helped reduce drag. They also used smaller propeller spinners. The revised prototype was dubbed the Experimental Improved Type 1 Ki-45.
And did this improved version finally deliver the goods?
Its maiden flight was in July 1940, and while they did have a bit of a hiccup with the cowling flap failing, which forced a landing, overall the design was a winner. It clocked in at 520 kilometers per hour at 3,500 meters, finally getting close to that target speed. They were on the right track.
So they had a design that was finally showing real promise. What was the next step?
They took those successful modifications and applied them to 5 more airframes that were already being built, and 2 more aircraft were constructed using the improved design.
So they were pushing forward with these modified prototypes, but was there any thought given to a more fundamental redesign?
You're right. All along, Takeo Doi, who'd been there from the beginning, was also spearheading a more comprehensive redesign. He wanted to push the performance envelope even further and make the aircraft easier to manufacture. This led to the development of the Ki-45 KAI.
So the Ki-45 KAI was a real step change from the earlier versions.
Absolutely. The KAI featured a much slimmer fuselage, giving it a sleeker profile that helped further reduce drag. They also redesigned the wings, going with a straight tapered design with a larger wingspan and area. This provided more lift and improved handling. And those pesky engine nacelles, they got a makeover too. They were mounted lower on the wings and had a smaller diameter, all aimed at making the aircraft slip through the air more efficiently.
They were really refining the design. And what about its punch? Did they beef up its armament?
Oh yeah. The Ki-45 KAI ditched those 7.7mm machine guns and got 2 12.7mm Type 1 machine guns in the nose. That's a serious upgrade in firepower. They kept the rear-firing 7.9mm Type 98 machine gun for defense and replaced the old telescopic gun sight with a more modern reflector gun sight.
Sounds like they were addressing all the major issues they'd encountered. What did the Army think of this revamped Ki-45?
They loved it. They saw the KAI's potential and gave their official stamp of approval in October 1940. The first Ki-45 KAI prototype was ready by May 1941. This was a pivotal moment in the aircraft's journey.
So after all those trials and tribulations, the Ki-45 was finally ready for prime time.
And it was finally given its official military designation, Army Type 2 two-seat fighter Model A Toryu. And you know what Toryu means.
Dragon Killer. Now that's a name that commands respect.
Exactly. Kawasaki also used their internal designation, Ki-45 Kala.
So when did this Dragon Killer finally get its chance to face a real dragon, so to speak?
The 5th Sentai, based in Kashiwa, Chiba Prefecture, was the first to receive the Toryu. They started operating the Ki-45 Kala in August 1942. However, the first to actually take it into combat were the 21st Sentai in Burma and the 16th Sentai in China. Both units arrived in their respective theaters in October and November of 1942.
And how did it perform in those early battles? Did it live up to its fearsome name?
It quickly proved its worth, especially in ground attack missions. Its heavy armament and those beefed-up fuel tanks made it a real force to be reckoned with when it came to strafing and attacking ground targets.
So they were discovering that it was more than just a long-range escort fighter.
Exactly. This realization led to the development of a more specialized version, the Ki-45 KAI, or Army Type 2 two-seat fighter Model B. It was specifically designed for attack and anti-shipping missions.
What set the KAI apart from the earlier versions? What made it such a good ship killer?
The biggest change was its firepower. The KAI had a 20mm HO-3 cannon in the nose, which had a good rate of fire and packed explosive rounds. But the real showstopper was the 37mm Type 98 cannon mounted in a tunnel underneath the fuselage. That thing could do some serious damage to ships, although it was a bit slow to reload because it had to be done manually.
I bet that 37mm cannon made a big boom. Any other improvements in the later KAI models?
Yes, they started using more reliable Mitsubishi Ha-102 14-cylinder radial engines. Those were also known as the Army Type 101. These engines cranked out 1,080 horsepower at takeoff and were housed in more streamlined nacelles, which helped with aerodynamics.
So they were constantly refining the design. Now, the Allies had their own nickname for the Ki-45, didn't they?
You're right, they called it Nick.
Mick. Not quite as intimidating as Dragon Killer, but I guess it did the job. And I recall reading about the Toryu seeing some heavy action in a particular theater of war.
It definitely saw its fair share of combat in the New Guinea theater. It was particularly effective against those U.S. Navy PT boats, and it gave those B-24 Liberator bombers of the U.S. 5th Air Force a run for their money.
And wasn't it in those encounters with the B-24s that they realized the Ki-45 could be a pretty good night fighter?
Absolutely. As the B-24s started flying more nighttime bombing missions, the Ki-45 Kala, with its dependable twin engines, proved to be surprisingly adaptable to the night fighter role. And remember, Having two engines is a major safety factor when you're flying at night.
No one wants an engine failure in the dark. So how did they transform those existing Ki-45s into night fighters?
Some clever folks on the ground started experimenting. They figured out that they could replace that upper fuselage fuel tank with two 12.7mm Type 1 machine guns, specifically the Ho-103 variant. And, get this, they mounted those guns at an angle so they could fire upwards.
So they were aiming for those bombers' bellies. Sneaky.
It was a brilliant move. It allowed them to approach the bombers from below, where they were less likely to be spotted, and then let loose with those upward-firing guns. And it worked.
Necessity truly is the mother of invention. And those field modifications caught the attention of the higher-ups, didn't they?
Absolutely. The Koku Hanbu, the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service General Staff, took notice of those successes and officially tasked Kawasaki with developing a dedicated night fighter variant based on those field mods. And that's how the Ki-45 KAI was born.
So the KAI is purpose-built for night fighting from the ground up.
It was, although they kept those powerful Mitsubishi Ha-102 engines from the later KAI models, the main focus for the KAI was on its weaponry. They wanted to give it the best tools for taking down those bombers in the dark.
Okay, so what kind of arsenal did they equip the KAI with?
It was packing some serious heat. The KAI had a semi-automatic 37mm Ho-203 cannon in the ventral tunnel. That thing could deliver a devastating blow. And of course, they incorporated those upward-firing guns that had proved so effective. They went with two 12.7mm Type 1 machine guns mounted in the fuselage, specifically angled for those attacks from below.
Now, I seem to remember reading about another KAI variant with even bigger upward-firing guns.
You're absolutely right. They took that upward-firing concept even further. They swapped out those 12.7mm machine guns for two 20mm Ho-5 cannons, also mounted obliquely in the fuselage, that significantly upped the firepower they could direct at those bombers' vulnerable undersides.
It's like they were turning the tables on those bombers, attacking from their blind spot. Now, we can't talk about night fighters without talking about radar. Did the Ki-45 KAI have radar?
That's the thing. The plan was to equip it with radar, housed in a pointed nose, which wouldn't have any guns. But the development and production of Japanese airborne radar was lagging behind. They just couldn't get it to work reliably on a large scale.
So no radar for the KAI. That must have been a major handicap.
It was a huge disadvantage. Only one Ki-45 was ever tested with the centimetric radar under a plexiglass nose, but they never really got it working properly.
So the vast majority of KAI night fighters went into combat without radar.
Sadly, yes. And despite that major drawback, they still turned out 477 of these radarless Ki-45 KAIs at their Akashi plant, which became the sole production facility for the Toryu from September 1943 onwards.
That's a lot of aircraft without a crucial piece of technology. But did they still manage to make a difference in defending Japan?
They did. The Ki-45 KAI became a key player in defending the home islands against those B-29 superfortress raids, especially in the later stages of the war. In fact, during the first B-29 mission over Japan, they managed to shoot down at least 8 of them.
Wow, that's pretty impressive considering they were doing it without radar. Those upward-firing cannons must have been quite effective.
They were a game changer, especially when those B-29s started flying low-altitude night raids in the final months of the war. The Toryu units like the 4th, 5th, and 53rd in the eastern sector, and the 5th, after being reassigned, 45th and 70th in the middle sector, saw a lot of action during those desperate night battles.
It must have been an incredibly intense and dangerous time for those pilots. And I understand that there's at least one Ki-45 KAI that made it to the United States after the war.
That's right. They shipped a Ki-45 KAI fuselage, serial number 4268, over to the States in 1946 for evaluation. They gave it the designation USAF FE-701. Today, that very fuselage is on display at the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center in Virginia.
It's amazing that a piece of history like that survived. Now, besides those dedicated night fighter variants, were there any other attempts to improve on the basic Ki-45 design during the war?
Yeah, back in August 1942, while the Ki-IO was entering service, Kawasaki was already working on a more advanced version, the Ki-45-2. They planned to use much more powerful Mitsubishi Ha-112 Tolissi engines, which could put out a massive 1,500 horsepower each. They also redesigned the airframe, giving it a wider wingspan and those distinctive square-tipped vertical tail surfaces for better handling.
So it was shaping up to be a pretty impressive aircraft. But the Ki-45 never actually saw combat as a two-seater, did it?
No, it didn't. In December 1942, the Army had a change of heart. They decided that for a pure fighter role, they didn't need that second crew member just to operate a machine gun. They wanted to go with a single-seat design. So they directed Kawasaki to turn the Ki-45-2 into a single-seat fighter, which eventually became the Kawasaki Ki-96.
So while it evolved from the Ki-45, the Ki-96 was a new beast altogether.
Pretty much. They incorporated some of the knowledge and aerodynamic lessons learned from the Ki-45-2, but the Ki-96 was mostly a brand new design.
Did the Ki-96 ever make it past the prototype stage?
They were really pushing to get it flying. The first prototype, which used a partially built Ki-45-2 fuselage, was completed in September 1943. They fitted it with a larger canopy for better visibility and fared over the area where the second cockpit would have been. The later prototypes were designed from scratch as single-seaters with all-around vision canopies. When they tested it, the Ki-96 performed really well. It handled beautifully and exceeded their expectations. But then, in a twist of fate, before the Ki-96 even had its first flight, the Army changed their minds again. They decided to scrap the whole single-seat, twin-engine heavy fighter concept. So sadly, the Ki-96 remained just a prototype. They eventually moved on to the two-seat Ki-102.
It's like the Ki-45 family tree had all these branches that never quite blossomed. Were there any other specialized versions of the Ki-45 that actually saw action?
Yes, they developed the Ki-45 Ka specifically for anti-shipping missions. It had a powerful armament setup with two 20mm HO-5 cannons in the nose, a 37mm HO-203 cannon in that ventral tunnel, and they kept the rear-firing 7.9mm Type 98 machine gun for good measure. They even experimented with mounting a huge 75mm anti-tank cannon on it, but the aircraft just couldn't handle the weight and recoil of that beast. The Ki-45 Ka was the last hurrah for the Army Type 2 two-seat fighter series.
So looking back at the Ki-45's entire career, it seems like that initial idea of a long-range bomber escort never really panned out.
You're right. It wasn't really cut out for dogfighting against those agile single-engine fighters like the P-40, but it found its niche as a pretty decent anti-bomber interceptor, especially at night. And it really shone in ground attack and anti-shipping roles thanks to that heavy forward-firing armament.
It sounds like it adapted and found its true calling.
Definitely. And sadly, like a lot of Japanese aircraft towards the end of the war, the Ki-45 was also used in kamikaze attacks. It was a desperate measure in a desperate time. A particularly poignant example was the attack on the USS Dickerson off Okinawa in April 1945.
A stark reminder of the tragic realities of war. And despite its successes as a night fighter, that lack of radar must have always held it back.
Absolutely. Those upward-firing guns worked wonders, but without radar, it was always fighting an uphill battle against those night bombers. And by the spring of 1945, with those American carrier-based fighters and land-based escorts operating from places like Iwo Jima, the Ki-45's time was coming to an end.
But its story didn't end with the war, did it? I recall reading about a few Ki-45s that continued flying after the war.
It's a fascinating footnote in its history. 3 Ki-45s ended up in the hands of the Communist Chinese after the war. Unlike a lot of other captured Japanese aircraft that were used for training, these 3 were actually assigned to a combat squadron. They flew missions in the late 1940s and early 1950s before finally being retired.
It's like they got a second life. So how many Ki-45s were built in total across all those variants?
They produced around 1,700 units, which is a pretty impressive number considering its rocky start.
And just to recap those main variants that saw action.
The main players were the initial production model, the Ki-45 Kala, the Ka-IB, the ground attack and anti-shipping specialist, the Ka-I, the dedicated night fighter, and the Ka-ID, another anti-shipping version. Each one had its own unique armament setup tailored to its specific role. And of course, we can't forget the Ki-45 Tall, which led to the single-seat Ki-96 prototype, although it never saw widespread service.
It's amazing to think that an aircraft that faced so many challenges during its development could eventually find such important roles in a global conflict. And it's incredible that we can still see a part of it today in a museum.
It's a testament to its resilience and adaptability. The Ki-45's journey, from a troubled prototype to a vital night fighter and ground attack aircraft, shows us how wartime pressures drive innovation. Even designs that seem flawed can, through refinement and some ingenious thinking on the battlefield, discover unexpected strengths and play a crucial role.
The Dragon Killer certainly carved out a place for itself in history. Well, folks, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the Kawasaki Ki-45 Toryu. We hope you found it as captivating as we did.
It's a story that highlights the dynamic, sometimes unpredictable nature of aircraft development. And it reminds us that technology can take some surprising turns, especially during times of conflict.
If you enjoyed this journey with us, please help us keep these incredible stories alive. Hit that like button, share this deep dive with your friends, and subscribe to the All Sorts podcast right here on YouTube. Your support means the world to us and allows us to keep exploring these fascinating corners of history, science, and everything in between. And remember, there's a whole treasure trove of past deep dives waiting for you in our YouTube library.
And to stay connected with the All Sorts podcast community, get those behind-the-scenes glimpses and make sure you don't miss our next adventure. Be sure to follow us on X, Instagram, and Threads. Keep those curious minds engaged, and we'll see you on our next deep dive.
Until then, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those minds wide open.